Well, good evening again. I'm Bob Graves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. And I enjoy the opportunities that we have to chit chat with each other, and I appreciate your comments. A lot of what I'm trying to do with this show is break up a lot of the hardened ground, as it were. You know, when you find ground that's been walked on and trodden over so much, it can get as hard as a road, and it's not like you can grow anything in it. Grass won't even grow in it. Hard to get trees to grow in it. It's amazing, grass can grow up through a cement or blacktop driveway, but it won't grow on a trodden, heavy, packed down path that people have walked on. And in some ways, that's a metaphor for traditional thinking in our Christian mindset that we've packed the ground so tightly, nothing can grow in it, and we can't grow in it. And it's important that we grow. I find it's sometimes difficult for me to relate the spiritual life that I find so meaningful to me in terms that are very traditional. And I'm speaking to a lot of the traditional ideas on this show, and in a sense, I'm not actually talking about my spirituality, but I'm talking about the things that I've abandoned. And it's not that I'm necessarily complaining about that, because if I was to talk about my spirituality as I understand it, as I embrace it, I would say words that might make a great deal of sense, but without the traditional mindset. Two things. Well, it's like throwing the seed out there on the hardened ground and it won't find root. Or these are things where we're using words that are in many ways metaphoric and that have meaning. But if you're using the metaphors of tradition, you might even love what I'm saying, but not realize I don't mean what you think I'm saying when I say it. So I find it helpful, necessary, and useful to actually take some time and focus on some of the traditional concepts that we need to really hold in question. Stop to think about it. It is amazing how silly, how foolish, how awful some good people can be when they're trying to be faithful and loyal to Jesus. If they feel and think that somehow that this text that they have is this inerrant word of God, instead of, I'm talking to someone earlier today about translations, and I said that you don't have to go both ways into this. You don't have to go one way or the other, where you just totally embrace this book or you just totally reject it. But it does help us when we get to the point where we realize that the biblical text came to us from people who had some authentic experiences, and for the most part, they're really telling us what they think we need to hear, and they're sharing with us their opinion based upon some authentic spiritual experiences, some transcending experiences that they've had themselves, some encounters that they've had themselves. But if we're going to start reading their opinions as somehow some authoritative point of view that we're not allowed to move forward from or move away from, well, then we find ourselves stuck in a paradigm of an immature age that didn't know half the things that we know today about human need, but being human. We've come out of a set of dark ages in some ways. The way we've treated each other as human beings is not a good history in many ways. When you look back at the days of slavery, of despotic kingdoms, serfdoms, we, even as Americans, we have launched a new sense of, well, it's not all as wonderful as we sometimes talk about it, but of democracy, which is so different from where the world was, that we're trying to be loyal to a paradigm that made sense to people who believed the world was flat. I don't think that's working so well for us. And so tonight I want to talk about a little bit more. I've been talking about this a few times, and I want to talk about it a little bit more. I want to talk about sin and this so-called doctrine of sin. Now, I do believe that the word, hamartia does appear in the text, and we translate it as sin. But I think we've turned this word sin into something extremely dramatic. Have you ever, sometimes our kids can pour on the drama and exaggerate the difficulty of some sort of a situation to the point where it's almost laughable how dramatic it gets. And there's a sense in which this is the doctrine of sin. It's it's a tirade of theology that's nothing other than, the drama queen of theology, I guess is one way of putting it. The effects of sin, what are they? Well, I think we're talking about some irresponsible excuses where we're trying to bring a silly dignity to the difficulties we genuinely have. Now, I'm not poo-pooing the idea that we as people are struggling. I'm not trying to say that we don't find ourselves tempted to make shortcuts or fall short, or that we don't, in ways, do things that really ought not to be done. We certainly do. But when we turn it into a huge, huge problem, I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot, and we're doing some things that are not going to help us, and things that actually end up perpetuating the problems that we do have. A lot of the problems that would be called sin are nothing other than developmental blooming. They're things we need to learn, good things that we need to learn, that until we learn them, we don't know what the good thing is. And that's not because we're sinful by nature, but it's because sometimes before a person can know what is good, they really have to learn the realities that exist outside themselves. They really have to become aware of the impact behaviors and choices have on others, and to learn to get outside themselves and see that. That's not in and of itself a sinful, evil, awful thing. It is a developmental awareness. Well, even developmental psychologists recognize that there's something about reaching middle age, that when most people reach the point in life that's just beyond half of their life expectancy, they begin looking at life differently. They begin looking at it in a way that turns more toward love, turns more toward mellow ideas. And this is a very common dynamic. It doesn't happen to everybody, but it happens to so many people that we recognize it as a real point of life where we begin to think radically differently. And it's as if we need to come to that developmental point where we realize I've already spent half of my probable time on Earth and in the best of health, and the second half is now getting ready to be embarked on, and it's going to include some acquired difficulties and problems as I begin losing my health, as I get older, as I lose my strength, and so forth and so on. And it causes us to begin to think and strategize differently in a way that represents a seriousness we're able to take on. It's kind of hard to take on when life seems like it's going to be around forever. That this is not necessarily an evil thing, but it is a wise thing for us to face these facts sooner rather than later. And given the freedoms that we have in this country, we're free to not face those things until we want to. Anyhow, I look at this doctrine of sin as taking some of the various issues that we have as human beings and by various issues, I'm talking about things where there are legitimate complaints that we could have about the behaviors we engage in, to just of fussing about things that make no difference, aren't important, and don't have to. I mean, when we worry about the length of somebody's hair, when we worry about whether or not women are wearing dresses or pants, or when we, there's some things that we just get just downright stupid and silly about. But I'm going to argue tonight that in some ways I perceive the doctrine of sin in some ways as an extremely childish and an extremely foolish way of trying to put some dignity on this problem that we have, where with all that dignity, we now acquire a double-edged sword where we can require people to grow up and get righteous, while also at the same time totally explaining why that's not possible to be done, and giving room for excuse, so that we don't really believe that growing up can be done or ought to be done, or or that most people will ever do it. And we're basically trying to give it a doctrine, a teaching that comes from God, so that we find ourselves okay with it. And I think it creates two extremes philosophically. This is just my own opinion. You've heard of the just world. Some people believe in a just world, and by that it means they believe that all things that happen for a reason. That God who does things, God who makes things happen, does so because somehow in his wisdom he knows what needs to be done. And therefore, people, when they suffer, they don't realize they need to be suffering, that this is part of the plan, and that this is a just world, that things happen ultimately in a way that is really actually quite justified. I'm going to argue that that just world is a way of trying to remain insensitive to the genuine issues that the word sin could really be dealing with. Some of the ways in which we really need to make some changes. We don't have to. We can come up with excuses and reasons as to why these things exist. Everything from slavery to unwanted pregnancies that supposedly won't happen because women can't get pregnant when they're attacked. There's also, in this silliness of an inappropriate dignity, in my opinion, there's a sense in which this doctrine of sin becomes, and not just this just world concept, but this unjust world concept. And the unjust world concept is one that believes that everything is so corrupt and so horrible, and everything is falling apart, that there are little things you can do to put out little fires, but ultimately it's a lost cause and you can't save it. And what amazes me is how many people seem to subscribe to both of those concepts at the same time, where they believe that everything that happens for a just cause from God's standpoint, but that from our standpoint, as we look at the world, that all these things that are happening are just irresolvably horrible, and we just live in a terrible, terrible, terrible world, and we're waiting for Jesus to return and all that stuff. But in the end, I think that these are just various ways of avoiding the kind of love we're called to have, the kind of growing up we really need to experience, and the sort of personal responsibility we need to learn to accept, without getting so hung up in shooting ourselves in the foot for having not gotten there yet. Now, the traditional view of sin begins many times with a sense of wanting to achieve a powerful sense of condemnation. Yeah. They need you to feel condemned. Condemnation achieves several different purposes. For one thing, if you feel condemned, you now have things to worry about, a destiny to worry about, a character to pine away that you have lost. This sense of condemnation of you are now condemned for being a sinner is is a strange, strange goal of this doctrine. For one thing, as a parent, as a person who is a teacher, who has students, as a person who has been an office manager and had people that I needed to work with, uh, and as a person who's had a variety of different positions of responsibility and what have you, I got to tell you something. I have never noticed that this concept of condemnation ever really works out so well. The people that get condemned by someone are usually written off. There's this big wall that goes up. And so this concept of condemnation is extremely counterproductive. To teach that people are condemned because of the issues and the problems they're struggling with, rather than loved by a father, a God, or even other people who'd love to be able to play some role in their lives that might help them to acquire the insight, the skills, the wisdom, the love, the life skills necessary to live a meaningful and significant life of love. This concept of condemnation is just totally counterproductive. It's ineffective. It doesn't accomplish anything. It establishes the problem, but in a perpetuating manner. There's a sense in which this condemnation is so immature. It's so knee-jerk reaction. It's so, I think, self-centered. What is the basis of condemnation? The only way I can condemn you is if I find your behavior to be something I don't like, something I don't want to have to put up with. There's a sense in which this concept of condemnation is really, as I see it, an immature attempt, maybe not always meanly intended, but a dysfunctional attempt to control the behavior of other people. It's almost as if we hope that if we condemn them, they'll feel such guilt and shame that they'll change. Whereas people who are condemned, by the time we're done condemning them, they can feel so useless that change is something they don't believe they're capable of engaging in. So this concept of condemnation under sin, in my opinion, is psychologically harmful. It is strategically useless. It gets nowhere. Now, by saying that, I am not trying to do away with the idea that I'm not saying, well, everything you do is just fine. I don't condemn you. It's not to say there aren't issues. It's not to say there aren't serious issues. It's to say that condemnation is not the response to these issues that works. It doesn't accomplish anything. I can't help but wonder if God had that figured out and how we ended up with this religious system that wants to not only have us condemned, but have us condemned by God. To me, that is such a psychological faux pas that it begs whether or not religion has any credibility whatsoever to be any claim to being somehow divinely sourced, that it comes from God. But anyway, condemnation is a big part of this doctrine of sin. And I think that it is a silly, immature, ineffective, shooting ourselves in the foot, backfiring approach to the issues that we struggle with, that we really struggle with. Leads to also the concepts of fallenness. Human beings are fallen. We sometimes use the word depravity, total depravity. Total depravity. You know, I know so many people, whether they're people of faith or not, that strike me as being just wonderful people, sensitive hearts, um, lovely relationships, genuine needs, real gratitude. I'm sorry, but I think if you're going to open your eyes and be honest, and if you're going to love people, this concept of thinking of human beings as totally depraved, it's a sick concept. It's a very ugly, sick distortion. It just it is something that I'd expect out of a borderline personality disorder. It is not something I'd expect out of loving, caring people. And the people that I know, um, whether they're people of faith or not, who are living happy, meaningful, productive lives, this just doesn't fit here. The concept of there being depraved and sinners by nature. They're trying to tell you that everyone is born a sinner. Now, it is true that we can learn how to do a number of things that shouldn't be done quite early, and I think of the psalm there, which says, that they are born speaking lies, and there's some theologians who want to think, oh, there's a word from God that is part of this teaching that we are born sinners, that we're born speaking lies. Now, if you can't read a text and spot an expression, you need to put the book down because you're dangerous. Um, they're born speaking lies is a picturesque way of describing how quickly people learn to lie and deceive, and they do. We all learn to hide things, but you know what? There's also a sense in which we are not careful enough as self-centered adults to deal with our kids in a way where they feel safe being honest. And I think that a great deal of the lying that kids can do is not just because they're trying to get away with stuff, but because they're not so sure that being found guilty of having done something with a big adult is going to be a safe way to go. And so their survival might require that they get a little bit creative. And so I don't think we can blame this entirely on some sort of supposed sin nature or depravity, everyone being born a sinner. They're trying to tell you also sin is our inclination. It's we're inclined to sin. It's in your nature, so much to the point that you're incapable of saving yourself. You're incapable of picking yourself up by your own spiritual bootstraps, as it were. Now, I see this as another form of also, this is an added element of total irresponsibility. It is a complete denial of the developmental capacity of human beings. That when we start out in life, we don't really know anything. We don't have the wisdom. We don't have the experience. We don't have the awareness that it takes for a caring and loving adult to just suddenly emerge out of us. And this concept of being sinners by nature is in some ways, I think, an excuse for not wanting to accept the very difficult and very wonderful task of being an adult helping little children to grow up into a world. If I could brag for just a moment, she didn't know I was going to do this. My wife is a nanny, and she is awesome. She deals with kids. She has a well thought out philosophy about how to handle children, how to make them feel safe and secure, how to draw the line and not allow certain behaviors, what to do with them, and how to handle the issues that come up and the problems that they have. And the kids that she has been involved in, she's been doing this since, oh my goodness, it's what, 25 plus years. She's really good with these kids. She knows how to handle them. And she's helped to raise some kids who have turned out to be wonderful people who've really developed well under her care. And I tell you this, it certainly wasn't by her taking a look at some of the things they're doing and having them sit in the sinner's corner. Maybe they had to do a little time out, but there's none of this concept of fallenness, of depraved, or there's no hesitation on her part to discover what she as an adult needs to do to play an instrumental and useful role in the development of these children. She's accepting this as a responsibility and not as a duty, but as a joyful opportunity to get to know some really wonderful kids. And I'll tell you, between my wife and I, we have one child. But I'll tell you this, we've had the joy of knowing many children who've, in some sense, become an extended part of our family because they were charges she was responsible for. She's been with 4 or 5 families by now. And so there's a lot of children we've kind of acquired along the way, and birthdays and things like that, and get to know some of these kids and get to love them. Um, there's other things that are going to be taught in this concept of sin. They're going to tell you that you're separated from God. Now we're going from the silliness to the projection. Now, I don't know if you've ever had this experience. Have you ever owed somebody money and you didn't have it? And you haven't seen them in a while. You're not sure how they're going to take it and what they're thinking of. Don't you kind of avoid them, And we've probably all in our in days when things weren't so well, been in that kind of an awkward situation. Whenever we have some issues that we're not comfortable with ourselves, or we're not sure how we look to others, it is very easy for us to perceive there being this wall. But I'll tell you what, people who care about you and people who love you, it's not that they're going to give you a license to do everything or anything, but people who care about you and people who love you don't want that wall to appear. Looks like we have a comment coming in. Let me see what we've got here. Viewer comment. I really enjoy your view of sin, Bob. It makes the concept of an angry God seem really silly. I thank you. I'm glad that it does, because I'll tell you, I would agree with you. I think it is, in some ways, it is philosophically absurd. If I'll tell you, if there was an angry God, we'd have been done away with a long time ago. And for God to be this patient and that angry is that's just kind of like suspending you, over the precipice indefinitely. It's nothing but an anxiety producing kind of concept intended to keep you under control. It is a silly idea. It doesn't really make sense. But of course, when you feel condemned, when you think that there may be this issue, when you hear what the dangers and the risks could be, particularly when you're young and immature, you're not so sure these are risks worth messing up with. So it can get you very quickly caught up into the being captured by this despotic, angry God. And what a horrible place to live your life while you're living in, I praise the Lord and this. And I remember one of the first times that I became aware of how absurd this could be. I was only about 21 at the time. And I remember going to a church, and there was a woman there telling me, "Oh, when you have kids, make sure that you bring them to church. Because I'll tell you what, my first kid, I had this child, and the first day I was out of the hospital, the first Sunday after I was out of the hospital, I stayed home, and I lost that baby." And she's trying to tell me how God killed her baby because she didn't take the baby to church the very first Sunday she was out of the hospital. And I've never heard anybody talk that way previous to this. I was not raised in a fundamentalist background, and to hear this kind of talk it made no sense to me. And it's like, and you worship this God? How can you do that? It doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, in your separation from sin, uh, this is the depravity, and it's your nature, and you're incapable of saving yourself. Um, this is just a mentality being placed upon you. This might sound a little bit odd, but some people wonder, is mankind basically good, or is mankind basically evil? Sometimes people ask this question. And my answer is that man is basically man. And there is a sense in which that is not good or bad. It just is. And I think that we can deal with ourselves and our need to develop if we realize that in some sense it's not good or bad just to be. It just is. Now, there are things that can be good for you, and there's the concept of good and bad. What is something that is good? What is something that is bad? Aren't we giving a subjective value to something based on how it goes with us in terms of how it works out? I think it's important that that man. I think it's a good thing that we're human beings. But I don't think that just being human is in and of itself a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. And it's therefore, in some sense, a non issue. Now that it's a non issue, from there we can say, well, what should we do with our time? What should we do with our lives? What should we do with each other? This can be a very good thing that we do in the way that it works out. But trying to assign some sort of value to things that simply are is a strange concept to me personally. But not to say that I denigrate or don't value being human. I'm really glad to be alive, and I love a lot of the humans I've gotten to know. But I'm trying to say that in terms of trying to put this into some sort of cosmic perspective. Uh, the good in our lives is the good that we can do, the good that can be the outcome of what we do. It can't possibly just simply be the essence of what we are. In some sense, that strikes me as meaningless. That the meaning can't be found there. That's not what makes life meaningful. That you just are. What have you. Meaning is something that we can bring. Goodness is something that is the outcome of things. And so we need to pursue outcomes in order for that to happen. But maybe I'm getting too philosophical. But in some ways, I think that so we don't need to kid ourselves by trying to either pump ourselves up or put ourselves down. We need to, focus on loving each other and being the kind of people that it's good to be. In terms of the way we behave and become and develop and the kind of lives we pursue and relationships that we pursue. Anyway, as they try and talk to you about how we've got this, separation from God. I need to take a look at my notes here. I wrote down a few things here. They tell you that you're dead in trespasses and sin. Even the book of Ephesians, it talks about how you were once dead in your trespasses and sin. And this is a concept that is also taken, in as far as I'm concerned, by the traditionalists as if it's literal. And here again, death is a metaphor. And I think it's an excellent metaphor to describe some of the ways in which we fall short as people, some of the ways in which we have failed to become everything we could be, and sometimes failed to be what we know we should be. Um, Death is a great metaphor. We think of death in basically, well, several different ways. For one thing, death is a process. We think of death as a process, and a person who's dying is a person going through a process of enduring demise. Those around them see the death coming, as it were. The person dying sees it coming, in a sense, when a person's going through that process. And the seriousness of life, it faces us all. The reality of the loss. Well, there's a sense in which when we're stuck in unproductive, counterproductive behavior, when we're trying to deal with the developmental issues that we have that arise out of our lack of love, I think death is a perfect metaphor for describing this. But when we start trying to say you're literally spiritually dead before God, um, I don't know what that really means, to be honest with you. I don't get it. I see the metaphor. I don't understand uh, the literal claim of it. It doesn't make sense to me. It seems to me it's just something more they want to latch onto, because if I can prove and teach from the Bible that you're dead, well, then for you to be alive, now I can get you to accept my Jesus, and so I just see it as more of the manipulation of spin by taking this metaphor, which in some ways I think is picturesque. Think about it. As a teacher in school, I often use metaphors, but the purpose of metaphor, when I use it, is to give to the student a picture of something that they can relate to so as to be able to understand something. If we're going to lose this concept of being dead in our shortcomings and lose the metaphor, how are we going to learn from it? You can't. There's nothing to learn. You're just dead. Well, no. But if you realize that people who won't accept the responsibility of recognizing that there are many issues that we do have, the many ways in which we fall short, many ways in which we have not been the loving people it would be good to be, then we can realize that this process of death is a picture of what our lives can sometimes be. We bring people worrying about where the end of this is going to be, where the end of this relationship is going to be, where the end of whether or not I'm safe or secure is going to be. And they watch us in some ways go downhill in character. Person who gets caught up in a drinking problem or in a drug problem. We watch them, we suffer with them as they go through this process. And likening it to the process of death, I think is very picturesque. And if they can see that picture, that might be enough of a reality check to help them to get serious about getting on the other side of that issue by accepting the kind of help, love, and different ways of looking at themselves and others that can perhaps get them on the other side of it. So I do see death as a very useful metaphor in the text. I just don't see it as this literal thing that you are literally dead in your trespass and spiritually dead to God and all that other stuff. But death is not just a process, it's a state. There comes a moment in time when each of us are dead. It's the way of the world. What do we do with the body? That is of all the things we need to do in life, that's the one thing that has to be taken care of. If somebody is, got a messy room, that's, we can tell them to clean it up, but you can go years without cleaning up the room. But if you have somebody living in your house and they die, within a certain period of time, you're going to have to do something with the body, or there's going to be some real serious problems. Now, in a sense, that's a metaphor that a life that is committed to or lost in the ways in which we can fall short, that is not moving forward in love and growing and developing, can sometimes create many situations where that's all we can do with it. We can't move from here. Sometimes we have to cut off relationships with some people. Or sometimes it destroys something so thoroughly that it's just gone. A drunk can sometimes drink away all the money and the family is now homeless. It's gone. What are you now going to do with the body of falling short? So I think that there's a sense in which the state of death can act as a metaphor for the word we have translated as sin that's over dramatized. But death is also an event. Now, for the person who dies, I don't know what sort of an event it is. Not sure, because once they're dead, we just can't talk to them about the event. They're probably having a very different experience. But death is an event that the rest of us experience who remain. The person who was once there, that once smiled, that was once there to interact with, that was once there having problems with, or whatever, they're gone. And there was this day that it happened. It becomes for us an event, in some ways a memorable one. And there are things that can come into our lives that can be ruined by our immaturity, by our lack of love, and they're gone, never to return. You might lose a limb, perhaps, or people who have left and will not come back, or opportunities that are gone and you will not be able to earn that one back. Sometimes people commit certain crimes that will thereafter exempt them from being able to do certain things legally again. Um, it's gone. For them, death was an event. And there's a ways in which some of our, well, I'm going to use the word sin. I don't like using it, but the word sin does stand for something, even though I think we've turned it into something far more dramatic. There are ways in which the shortcomings we do have, the missing of the mark, the failure to grow, the failure to love, the failure to grow up, brings into our lives certain events that where those opportunities are now gone and they're not coming back. It's just the way it is. And I think that that is also a great picture to help us to realize this is serious. Learning to love, learning to be good people, learning to be spiritually alive people is radically important. I need to take a look at where are we doing for time. Um, okay, very good. I lost my clock. I didn't see where it was. Separation from God. I see this as a projection. Our death is not a literal death. It's a proverbial. It's a metaphoric death in a sense, and I think it's a very wonderful picture. I think it is a very clear picture, and I think it gives us a better sense of just how serious some of these issues can be. But in some ways, to think of us as separated from God through this death is projecting upon God the problem we're having with it, not the problem He's having with it. I've known people to have a problem. Sometimes, as a professor, I have a student who's like getting behind on their work. They owe me some labs, or they owe me this and they owe me that, and they're not coming around with it. And sometimes this student will start avoiding me. And that's not a good thing, you know. But I'll tell you, as a professor, the last thing that I'm interested in doing is finding this student and reaming them out, or giving them reason to think that they had better not come around me. This separation that they're experiencing is something that's happening entirely on their part. I want to work with them and get them engaged with the material and get through the course as best I can. This guilt and shame before God is actually in some ways a projection of the way we unproductively think about ourselves. Let me say something about guilt and shame. Guilt and shame have sometimes been defined in ways that are similar. And so we use the words interchangeably sometimes, but I want to kind of define them for useful purposes here. There's a sense in which guilt can be a healthy thing. When you've done something you shouldn't have done, I think it's very healthy for you to own up, admit it, be honest about it. In a sense, that sense of guilt is very proper, very helpful, very constructive. But shame is the sense that I am useless, worthless, and awful because of the fact that there's something that I have done. I want to say that I find that to be actually an excuse. That is so irresponsible. That is such an irresponsible way of dealing with guilt. If there's something you've done that you shouldn't have done, why don't you do something to help undo that, or take responsibility for it, or help the people affected by it? Why don't you take some proactive approach? But this sense of shame, where you condemn yourself or feel useless because there was something that you did. You know what shameful people do? People who feel shame, they see that as part of their essence. If there's something you've done that you feel shame about, and you feel the shame, that's a sense of what you're telling yourself. That's my nature. Just the kind of a person I am. And you're really setting yourself up to make whatever it is you did, that which is going to be the only option you have in the future. And that's not And that's not gonna help you at all. I have viewer comments saying, "Bob, I am so ashamed of my inability to feel guilt." Well, good. Send me your tithe, and you'll get over it. Um, but this concept of shame is a terribly unproductive thing. When you feel shame, there is a sense in which you are actually using shame as a way of avoiding a proactive solution in response to things that you've done. And you're giving yourself excuse for not having to grow up. Shame is a very counterproductive thing. And I'm not trying to shame you if you have shame. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say that this is if you are experiencing shame, I think that's a helpful thing for you to then realize you are spinning in a circle. You're in a tailspin. This isn't working for you. You're going to have to find a way to pull out of it because it isn't going to do anything useful for you. Shame is uh, the only thing useful about shame is to recognize that you are in that tailspin. And other than that, it serves no purpose whatsoever. It's a projection. It's also a projection upon others and God as to how they must value in light of the fact that there's something you've done. Your value is not found in what you have done. The experience we have of you is found there, but your value is in what you are yet to do, who you are currently. And since that can change, what you have done in the past, if you can learn from it, you can convert a useless experience into something very useful for the future. What is there to be ashamed about that potential? But shame cuts off that potential, makes it impossible to really pursue. um, the loss of fellowship. There's other things, and we're running out of time to cover it. But this doctrine of sin tries to add to it other things, like you now become volitionally corrupt. You don't have the ability to choose right anymore. Perceptually, you're blind. You can't see the spiritual realities. You can't discern things. True love is an impossibility for you. All you can do is focus on self-indulgence. Of course, these are teachings that, in some ways, um, uh, were championed by people who accepted the Augustinian concept of sin. And Augustinian's concept of sin was derived out of his own experience of sex addiction, which is, hey, do you want an addict defining for you human nature? I don't think so. But let me ask you this. How can you ever overcome genuine problems that might be in your life, genuine problems of your own behavior, genuine problems of your own immaturity, genuine problems that might exist because of ways in which you've been set back? How can you possibly overcome these genuine problems if you're going to accept this teaching about yourself and your nature? Because bottom line is, in your life, you can't ever really behave in a way for very long that is contrary to the way you honestly perceive yourself in your own personal truth. You can't do it. It's not possible. So embracing this kind of an idea and notion about yourself is only setting the limits as to where it is you will dare go. It's setting the limits of any excellence to which you are really capable of achieving as a human being, as a person who loves, as a person who cares. So how can you possibly overcome these issues? Well, that I think is a good question, because I think the answer to that is this. Well, you can't. That helps us sell you the religion. Since I've sold you a bunch of doctrine and you now believe this about yourself, this leaves you in a tailspin and in an unproductive life. And I can just promise you that if you'll be faithful to the Jesus as I preach him, and to the God as I teach you about him, and particularly to the organization or institution that I'm trying to make you a part of, and make sure you support us as well. Well, that's just only going to make it work all the better. But it really leaves you the loser. I think you need to shed these ideas. They're not going to work for you. There's no special grace required. The love of God can be something very real. You are a lovely and wonderful human being. I love you. I don't even know you. But I think we need to get rid of this dramatic sense of sin. Start dealing with our lives responsibly and enjoying them and enjoying each other, enjoying ourselves, enjoying being who we are, and get rid of this nonsense that so defames us and disengages us from the opportunities we have to really become even better at what we do. Anyway, we're out of time. Thanks for listening to me rant and rave about this concept of sin. I'm Bob Graves, the unconventional pastor, and we'll see you again.